And thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. And if I can get a thumbs up, if you can see the screen, beautiful. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Simamora. My pronouns are he, him. I am a lecturer and a fellow at the Life Design Lab at Stanford. And it's really a pleasure to be with you today. You might be wondering, what in the world is the Life Design Lab? And so with a very brief introduction, we say that, or we used to say, that we teach those classes that help you figure out what you want to be when you grow up. And then we realize that there's an embedded assumption in that phrase, when you grow up, because it assumes that there's some final destination or state. And then after that, you're good. And if you just interrogate your own lived experience, you realize, oh, that's not really true. So we revised it to be a bit more accurate, which is that we teach those classes and we design those experiences that help people figure out what they want to grow into at any stage as their life unfolds. And so my hope for today is to share 5 ideas and practices that other students and participants have shared with us. They have found very helpful in their life design, in the hopes that it might be of benefit to you. And then hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for questions. I'm going to ask Kwaku to just monitor the chat, since sometimes I find it difficult to toggle between the two. And off we go. So I don't know about you, but my life often feels like this. It's a bit of a rushing river. It's a river I've opted onto often, but I'm going downstream and it sometimes feels out of my control. I'm always going from one thing to the next. And if you've been at this conference now, the second day, you probably have a lot of ideas percolating. You've been going from one thing to the next. So what I'd like for us to do, if you're willing, is to find some space to settle. Let's practice a collective pause. And so at this point, I'm going to invite all of you to go ahead and just adopt a posture that feels dignified to you. So something that is alert, yet relaxed. And I invite you to bring attention to where your body makes contact with the earth. So the soles of your feet with the ground underneath you, your sit bones with the chair. And if it feels safe and accessible to you, I invite you to close your eyes. Although you don't have to, you can just cast your gaze downward. And I'm going to invite us to go ahead and do 3 collective breaths. And we're going to inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. And when you feel ready, you can flutter your eyes open if they were closed. And I know from my own experience that I find these moments of pause to be quite helpful, even if it's just a few seconds, because what it does for me is that it settles everything down. So what used to feel like this rushing river now feels like a calmer lake. And what I find so helpful about that is that now there's a sense of clarity. And the clarity is really helpful because after this pause, I can begin to pay attention. What's happening around me? What's happening inside my body? What's working? What isn't working? What are some things that I need to turn my attention to? What are some things I feel grateful for? All of these questions, which I don't tackle all at once, but the pause allows me to bring my attention, right? To step back and notice, which is the key designer practice, because that's the ground of design. When you begin to notice what's actually happening and what feels important to you, you can decide what questions to engage with, what questions to design around. And so while seemingly a very simple practice, it's a very powerful and important one. And one of the ways that I practice my pausing is in a weekly therapy session with Sharon. So I've been seeing Sharon since 2001. And some people might say to themselves, well, you need to get a new therapist because she's clearly not working. And that's a perspective, right? But that's a perspective that frames therapy through the lens of like, oh, I go to therapy to get fixed. But actually, I look at it from a very different angle. So for me, therapy is a regular, ongoing, structured, reflective practice which is tended to by someone who is trained to care for the well-being of my mind. And so for me, the weekly therapy is one form of pause that I have in my life. And a lot of the design questions in my life emerge from this space. So the first idea and the first practice is how might you design pause into your life so that you can pay attention. And this can feel hard. I want to acknowledge that. We're so busy in this culture in particular. We're very over-indexed on achievement and accomplishment. But if you can find even small pauses in your life, or if at least you can pause when your body is asking you, please pause, you might be surprised what you find. Now, when you pause and things that matter to you begin to clarify, we can begin exploring practice number 2, which is building a compass. So there's a meta-narrative out there that you should know where you're going by now. And if you don't, you're late or something is wrong. But if you do, essentially you just plug the coordinates into the GPS and then you follow the path that's given to you. If you hit a setback, you just go an alternate route. But that's really the purpose of life. You should know where you're going and then you should get there. Now, maybe for some of you, this feels true. I don't want to deny that for some of you, you feel like a very strong sense of destination. And here's the thing. Sometimes life throws us these great disruptions that we don't anticipate. And all of a sudden, the destination we thought we were headed to is very unclear. Or if you've gone through a transition, which if we're here on this talk, I'm going to bet that all of us have gone through transitions, those transitions can feel really foggy and uncertain. And so what happens then? And so when there's a limiting narrative, designers will often try to find a different angle, an angle that's a bit more expansive so that you can generate more ideas and more possibility. And so what if we think about creating a compass, something that allows you to orient and ground in your values and what matters to you, even if you don't know the exact next step you'll take or the exact destination you're headed to. And so what does this look like concretely? So one of the ways we encourage and invite our students to create a compass is through a work view and a worldview. So the work view is your articulation of what work is for in your life. It's necessarily very distinct to you. Everyone's is going to be different. But some of the questions you might want to explore include, why do I work? What is the role of work with my family? What is the relationship between my work and society? What's the role of money? That's a big one. And as you begin to reflect on these questions and articulate them, and you can express these in text or imagery or both, all of a sudden you have a frame of reference you can go back to, maybe an anchor that you can ground in as you go through uncertainty or you have to make decisions. So instead of being reactive and working from a place of vacuum or fear, you can lean in and say, well, this is what I believe work is for me in this stage of my life. You can then go from there. There's also something called a worldview, which, like the work view, is your articulation of what life is for you. Why are we here? What makes for a good life? What is the role of joy and sorrow and justice and injustice? Kind of the big questions we don't always get to, but creating a little space to think about this and articulate it can be quite helpful in helping you navigate uncertainty. Now, you don't have to worry about getting it right, because as you evolve and grow as a person, these will necessarily change. As you go through different seasons of life, these will change as well. And if you were to read my worldview, you would see that it clearly centers my 2 sons. So that's Pax on the left and Aiden Luce on the right. And what they do for me is really give me a sense of purpose. And so my worldview, which I just revised this past month, is all about them. Like, what does it mean to be a father? That's the foremost role. And then how that informs my workview is that my workview now is really focused on the kinds of work that allow me to do good work and be a father. Now, I want to acknowledge that I have privilege in my life that allows me to choose into specific kinds of work. So this may not be necessarily accessible to everyone, but just grounding in what matters to you gives you a sense of agency, even in the face of constraints. So practice number 2. What if you built a compass and you revisit it regularly? And one way to do that might be to define a workview and worldview, although that's not the only way to do it. So now you have this compass, you're navigating the world, and another really great skill that designers practice is the generation of ideas. If you are facing a question or a problem that you feel stuck on, you're not making progress, chances are that the kinds of ideas that you have brought to this particular question or problem are not helping you make headway. So how might you see it from a different angle so that you can access new ideas? And so designers practice this all the time, right? So how might I have at least 3 ideas? Because typically we come to a situation with our first idea, and then we think generating ideas is having a second, and then we choose this or that. But how might you get in the practice of generating lots of ideas? And where might this be helpful? So another meta narrative out there is that there's one best life for you. So your job is to go ahead and find that right life and then engineer and optimize your way into it. In fact, many people come to designing your life with that sort of mindset. But here's the thing. When you think about best or right, that means there's only one. So there's one best life and every other possibility is somehow failing. That binary isn't very generative. It isn't very expansive. In addition, I mean, is it really possible to calculate, given all the variables and all the things out of your control, what is the best life for you? There's no algorithm that you can run, because if there was, we wouldn't be sitting here. We would just run the algorithm. So how might we reframe into a more expansive state? Because often this best life narrative can feel constraining, even suffocating. Well, one way to think about it then is, what if there are multiple lives that could unfold, that if you lived into any one of them, they would feel very aligned with who you are, what matters to you, your gifts, your talents. And here's the thing, you can't live all of them. Like, that is one of the things, one of the constraints of this human existence. But maybe any one of those could be ones that you feel really good about. So how do we concretize that? Well, one of the exercises we have are called Odysseys. What if you vision 3 possible futures for your life that were radically different from each other? And so one of these is the life that you might tell today. Basically, take everything that's happening personally and professionally and otherwise and extend it 5 years. What if aspects of life number 1 weren't accessible anymore? The job you're doing, the industry you're in, no longer exists. So what might you do? And then option 3, which is what we call the wild idea. This is where, for the purposes of ideation, right? We're not planning, just for ideation. What if you release the constraints? What if you assumed you would have just enough resources and just enough support, and status and reputation wouldn't be an issue? What might you pursue? Because I don't know about you, but oftentimes I take those things that feel maybe a little bit out of reach and I put them in a drawer somewhere, and that's where they stay. And what the wild idea does, it invites you to really throw all of those drawers open, take everything out and put them on the table and look at them with fresh eyes. Why can't I do that? There's a really interesting phenomenon. When we have students share their Odysseys, we ask the listeners to raise their hands if they think the person who shared their wild idea could actually attain it. And almost always, hands go up. Oh, they absolutely could. So it's interesting that others think they can accomplish it, but the person themselves doesn't see that as a possibility. So this is a kind of like this invitation of, let's bring it on the table. Let's not put it out to the side. Now, these 3 lives being so different might teach you something about yourself, about where you're at, where you might want to go, might surprise you. It might also teach you about things that you thought you might want, but then in contrast to the others, you're like, I actually don't want that. All of that is wonderful data, because these are not plans. These are just ideas to help you navigate your way forward. And so there's a template for this kind of exercise and all sorts of ways that you can complete this. And really, this can take all sorts of forms. We've even had someone bake a cake that represented their 3 particular Odysseys. And so with this in mind, practice 3 is get into the practice of generating lots of different ideas when faced with questions. And one way to do that tomorrow is to just create your Odysseys, 3 radically different futures for yourself, and then ask, what am I noticing? What am I learning about what I might want in this next stage of life? Idea number 4 is prototyping. So what a prototype is, when we think about design in the world of products and services, is a small scale representation before you get to a finished product. So you don't go from idea to finished product, you go from idea to prototype, you get user feedback, you do another prototype, You probably do that hundreds of times until you get to the finished product or service. And the reason you do that is because you have limited time, you have limited resources. And so you want to make sure that if there are any assumptions you're holding, you expose them and see if they're right or wrong. Sometimes you learn you're going down the wrong direction. So you want to go in a different direction entirely. And you want to do that before you spend too much time and resources. And you can do that in your own life. So the meta narrative, I think, often is, hey, the big pivot or jump into the deep end of the pool. Sometimes I've heard it said, like, just take that step off the cliff into the deep unknown and have faith. I'm not saying that's bad advice at all. And it's really good for narrative. But when you have limited time and resources, another strategy is just to dip your toe in the water and ask yourself, how do I like this water? What am I learning about this water? Is this water I want to continue being in? And so you can do this in your life in two ways. There's something called a prototype conversation. This is where you sit down with someone who is living the future you are curious about, but you don't know too much about it, and you try to get their story. And what their story will do is it will do things in your affective environment, right? In your emotional state. It will do things in your body. You'll start feeling inspired or dread, or you feel bored, or you'll start feeling a pit in the ball of your stomach. Something will happen. And what's happening is called narrative resonance. That story is allowing you to surface data that you can then use to determine, do I want to explore that curiosity a little bit more, or do I want to step away? So very quickly, I thought I wanted to go to law school in 2005. And so I sat down with 3 friends, and 3 out of 3 people said they hated law school, hated it. Now, what was interesting is not that they hated it, it's why they hated it. Because as they told me their stories, I began to realize that if I were in those same situations, given what I know about myself, I probably wouldn't like it so much either. And that's a lot of money and time to be miserable for 3 years. Now, it's not going to be miserable for everyone, but given my particular needs and wants at the time and what the stories were teaching me, I knew that that wasn't a future for me. So I stepped away from it and didn't go to law school. So those conversations literally changed my life, and everyone has a story that can change your life. So you can prototype through conversation. You can also prototype through experiences. You can get a felt sense of something before you jump in with more time and resources. So an example of that is my friend Paul, who during the pandemic started baking bread, like many of us, but it's a part of his cultural heritage. He's a Coptic Egyptian, and his lineage, they make a kind of bread called sun bread. So he would bake this in Oakland. And what he discovered was that he was really good. Someone said, hey, you should start a business. And intuitively, before he went that route, he said, let me just try scaling up. I make 2 to 3 loaves of bread a week. Let me see what 15 to 20 would feel like. And here's what he learned. He learned that he loves baking bread because it gets him away from the computer and working with his body. He learned that he loved the act of generosity of showing up in someone's doorstep and leaving a loaf of bread in a time of social distancing. And he learned that he didn't like baking that much to make 20 loaves of bread. And so he didn't give up his job. There was no big pivot. And the prototype works beautifully because he learned really important information about himself and that curiosity. So you can also learn through experiences. So practice number 4 is to tune into what you're curious about. Don't jump in all in the deep end, try something and then see what you learn. You can do that through conversations, or you can do that through short form experiences. The final idea I'll leave you with, which is not like an official part of the life design curriculum or the book, is this idea of nourishing. I have seen people come to designing your life with the idea that what they're going to do is to optimize all pain and all suffering out of their life. And it's always a big bummer when we have to break it to them that, yeah, there's nothing or no one that's going to be able to do that for you. They're inextricably linked. So when you are living life and things feel like they're hard and you have pain and suffering, that isn't a sign that you're living life wrong. That's just a sign that you're living life. Well, how do we work with the hard things? And one way that I've learned is if we stay nourished, we can work with the hard stuff in life. And so in 2016, I was going through a very tough time, lots of transition, becoming a father, work that was having a toll on my body. And I was really worried about a health concern. And one day my wife sends me a text message and it's an audio file. And I pick up my phone and this is what I hear.
We have left.
Sound of my son Pax laughing. And he was about 8 months old at the time. And it became my practice whenever I panicked, whenever I felt like I was overwhelmed, to reground in the voice of his laughter. And that simple act, that simple recentering of what mattered in my life was deeply nourishing and allowed me to get through that time. Another form of nourishment is community. These are just a few of my friends who showed up on my doorstep to surprise me from all parts of the world on my 40th birthday. And they're wonderful because they give me the space to be my cranky, introverted self. So I'm hard to stay in touch with, but they still show up to give me love. And that weekend was so nourishing to me because it just reminded me of the simple act of being in community, sharing food, playing games. Like that's it. Like I sometimes make life to be this big thing and big accomplishment. No, right there around me, there was a lot of nourishment. And so the final idea is to think about how might you nourish yourself along the way with love. And I think Kwaku is giving me the signal that we're at time. Look at that timing. Thank you so much, Kwaku. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much for these valuable insights, Christian. We have a few questions from our audience. The first question is, how can we separate what we think we should want from what we actually want in life?
Wow, that is a really, really good question. Because we have so many narratives in our lives that we've internalized. Sometimes we don't know where they come from. Sometimes we do, like, oh, that's my dad, that's my mom. Sometimes they're in the cultural waters. And so I would say that there isn't any one and easy answer, but being in the practice of pausing and reflecting on, first, what are the narratives that I hold? Just start there. Like, just notice that without judgment, right? We all have narratives and some of them serve us at different times. So the next question could be, is this narrative serving me or not serving me? And then we can ask ourselves, if it's not serving me at this time, what is a narrative that might? And, this isn't just to be done by yourself. Like, this can be done in community with others, with friends, if you're part of a faith community, with an elder. So that's one approach on how we might discern what's something that I'm feeling pressured to do versus what I might want to do.
Thank you. And one other question is, so sometimes when we're making decisions, it's easy to make decisions when you're considering two very different possibilities, but when your options are within the same neighborhood of value, how do you guide yourself towards what might be the better option?
Mm-hmm. So when decisions are on a par, and I'm going to invoke the name of Ruth Chang, who's a professor of philosophy at Rutgers, we integrate one of her ideas into our curriculum, which is that when choices feel about equal and you're struggling and agonizing over what to do, don't worry about doing the best choice. There is no best. So ask yourself a different question. Remember, reframe into a space of possibility. So the question would be, who do I want to be on the other side of that decision? And then make the decision that aligns with who you think you might want to be. In other words, as she would put it, you are the author of your own life in that particular context. So that might be one idea, and hopefully that feels helpful to the person who asked it.
And the final question we have is, how do we maintain a sense of clarity in a very competitive environment such as our school, when you're always thrown into the hot seat to make decisions on the go?
Competitiveness, the hot seat, these are big questions. I will say this, right? Like, everyone has to figure out for themselves what feels like the right thing to do. So, for example, there are situations in which if you're in a competitive environment and you have a particular goal, like, you might have to compete. And the question becomes, A, what is it that I want out of this experience? And B, how might I navigate it in a way that doesn't make me fall off what my values are and what matters to me? Because that's the thing, right? it's very hard to reclaim oneself when we start being untrue to ourselves. Like the first time it's like, oh yeah, I'm just making a little compromise. But then if you make too many compromises, in aggregate, you've made a big compromise. And then it's hard to know who you are. And that's when a pause might be helpful. But there's no easy answer to that. We live in a very competitive society. We're always measuring ourselves against each other. That's in the cultural waters. That's the water we swim in. So it can be hard to say, I'm going to live in opposition to that. And you can still find your agency, even in the midst. You can ask yourself, how will I navigate this, as opposed to how should I?
Wow. Thank you so much, Christian. Unfortunately, we don't have much time. Otherwise, we would love to hear more from you. And feel free to drop your contact if you would like others to reach out with questions beyond this conference. And thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And thanks for coming, Christian.
Thank you so much. And I invite anyone to go ahead and email me if they have questions. It was a real honor to be with you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.